Washington, D.C. I am Karen Donfried with the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this book launch for a wonderful new book, Partners of First Resort, America, Europe, and the Future of the West. And we are joined today by the two authors of this book. And I am very happy to say that both of them have affiliations here at GMF. We have Ambassador David McKean, who is a senior fellow at GMF, and he formerly served as the Director of Policy Planning at the U.S. Department of State, and also as U.S. Ambassador to Luxembourg. And his co-author is Dr. Bart Szewczyk, who is a non-resident fellow here at GMF, and he is also an adjunct professor at Sciences Po in Paris. He formerly served on the policy planning staff at the State Department and as an advisor on global affairs at the European Commission's think tank. And the topic of their book, and I'm just going to show you the lovely cover of the book. And Bart and David have told me that the book is coming out soonish, but I can tell you, you can already pre-order it. And I would encourage all of you to do that because you're going to want to have it as soon as it's available, because it is on a topic that I know is near and dear to the heart of everybody who's tuned in. And that topic is that the world still needs a united West. And they're making an argument about how Europe and the United States can renew their alliance. So what I want to do is give David and Bart a chance to share with us the main argument they're making in the book. So I'm going to have a conversation with them to start. And I want everyone who's listening to be part of the conversation. So while you are listening to us talk at the start, please go to the Q&A button near the bottom of your Zoom screen and just send in questions. And I will be monitoring that and weave as many of them as I can into the conversation. So look forward to your joining us as well. So with that, David, let me turn to you first. Kick us off in terms of sharing the main argument that Bart and you are making in this book.
Sure. Well, thanks, Karen. Thanks for having us today. Our fundamental argument, I think you've stated it in your introduction, it's that the transatlantic relationship is really key to the global order, to the rules-based order. And we believe that that has been fraying. We argue in the book that that's been fraying for many years, but that during the last 4 years, it was essentially shattered. And I don't know if any of you saw an article that David Ignatius wrote in the Washington Post last month, but he quoted Henry Kissinger, who identified two principles that he believed were critical to reestablishing the global order, the rules-based order. And he said one was common purpose on big issues, even as other rivalries continue. And the second is mutual security for all powers. And these are really sort of fundamental principles. They are the bedrock of the transatlantic relationship. And I'm going to come back to them, and Bart will come back to them throughout this discussion. But I want to just take a minute and just tell you a little bit about how we structured this book. So the first half of the book is really about, it's really a history of the transatlantic relationship. And some of it's quite well-trodden territory that many of you are familiar with, but we believe that it's important to identify where we've been in the past in order to understand where we are today. And I don't want to overdraw the comparisons, but during the 1930s and early 1940s, there were a lot of similarities. We were in the 1930s, as everyone knows, in the middle of a depression. We had a president until 1932 who blamed the economic woes essentially on foreign powers. And when President Roosevelt took office, he was faced with a very isolationist public. There was a very strong America First movement at that time. That was the the name of an organization, America First. And in the early late 1930s, early 1940s, it was really a struggle between authoritarianism cloaked in fascism and democracy. And so we're seeing some of that again today. And one of the key historical events that we focus on is, and I think it was great in your introduction, Karen, to the movie or the clip that you showed, because I think it was Roosevelt and Churchill in August 1941 off the coast of Newfoundland, when they had this secret but very important meeting about the future of the West. And at the time, of course, Churchill was in desperate need of military assistance from the United States. London had been bombed mercilessly. Britain was weak. It was nearly bankrupt. So he was there to get military assistance. And Roosevelt was there to reassure him that that would be on the way and that it would continue. But he was also very interested in the post-war world. Roosevelt was already setting out his vision. And he understood that the Treaty of Versailles had failed miserably, and that because Britain was had an empire, that its acquiescence to certain principles would be extraordinarily important to the future. And so they laid out in the Atlantic Charter a vision consisting of certain principles. And foremost among those was the disarmament of aggressor nations in the future, of speaking particularly to Germany, to Nazi Germany and Italy, but also self-determination for people around the world. And this was obviously a huge concession on the part of Churchill, because again, this was he was the leader of the British Empire. And so for him to acknowledge that in the future, that would be an underlying principle was significant. Roosevelt was also very concerned with the sovereignty of nations. And he really took his domestic vision, and which consisted of universal values, and applied it to the Atlantic Charter. He had given a speech called the Four Freedoms: the freedom of worship, freedom of speech, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And essentially that became a component of the Atlantic Charter as well. And so with this vision, it became essentially the backdrop for the evolution of all of the transatlantic and global institutions that we know so well today. And I'm referring to the United Nations, which was created in 1945, NATO, which followed a few years later, the Treaty of Rome in 1957, which ultimately led to the founding of the European Union, the IMF, the World Bank. You can go on and on. And in our book, Bart and I call for a restatement of the Atlantic Charter, an updating. And this is something, I wish we could say we're the first ones to do this. We're not. This is something that the first President Bush called for. It's also something that Kissinger, again, has said he believes is important, and he is in favor of a restatement of the Atlantic Charter for the 21st century. And we understand that when you have a vision as policy planners, and Karen knows this because she was served on the policy planning staff as well at one time, that you need to understand what the challenges are. You need to understand what the impediments are. You also have to always ask yourself, what are the alternatives? And what I find is that often when you lay out a vision, people are always saying, well, that's not going to work, but they don't give you any alternatives. And so we understand that there are a lot of challenges here, but the important thing is to create a strategy that will meet those challenges. So why don't I stop there? I know Bart's going to talk a little bit more about the history, but Karen, if you have some questions or would like to begin down the road of a conversation here, let's do that as well.
Yeah, no, that was a great sort of setting of the landscape of the book. And I just wanted to say that David mentioned that the first half of the book is really a history of transatlantic relations. And I just want to say, this is a relatively succinct book. And so while you might think, oh, history of transatlantic relations, the way they do it is very readable. And so they sort of gallop through this post-war history, sharing the highlights of the real in a way that I think is very easy to understand and adds to the story that they tell. So Bart, let me let you jump in and complement what David said to give our listeners a fuller sense of the book. You just need to unmute, Bart.
You'd figure after having done these calls so many times that we managed to remember to unmute ourselves. I think actually the quote of the year is "You're on mute" or something like this. But I started to say that I wanted to thank you, Karen, and thanks to GMF for hosting us. You know, GMF is really the center for transatlantic debates and for creative thinking about how to reimagine the transatlantic relationship, and that is really the aim of our book. And, you know, if you, like Karen said, we do provide a brief overview of what our version of what we think is most salient about the history of the transatlantic relationship. And in our view, you know, during the Cold War, the relationship really quickly settled into a relatively stable equilibrium, with the U.S. in the predominant role as security guarantor, even as there were ups and downs in the relationship, such as the Suez Crisis or Charles de Gaulle's withdrawal from NATO's military structures. And it's interesting that while European partners committed troops alongside the United States during the Korean War, no European countries supported U.S. efforts during the Vietnam War. But people sometimes mythologize the simplicity in transatlantic unity during the Cold War, because the real golden age, as it were, of the West and the liberal order occurred during the 1990s, in our view. You had NATO and EU enlargement, the notion that all major powers, including Russia and China, would become liberal democracies, and the basic entrenchment of this Western standard for global success, democracy, human rights, rule of law, free trade, and market capitalism. In the subsequent decade, in the 2000s, you know, obviously 9/11 and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq dominated U.S. foreign policy concerns, but they did not fundamentally change the strategic trajectory of this liberal model. And then we fast forward to the financial crisis of 2008 and the Russia-Georgia war, which from both internally, externally, significantly undercut this strategic narrative. And so, you know, in our view, in essence, the modern story of the West is a struggle between the hopes of 1989 that led to this confident decade of the 1990s, you know, a decade that in many ways meant the success and enlargement of the liberal order. And then the fears of the real fears of 2008, a year remembered for its internal challenges and external threats from liberal actors. You know, in some ways, the West had become a victim of its own success. Its model of democracy, human rights, rule of law, and market economy had really widespread appeal around the world. And the first post-Cold War generation during the 1990s and 2000s transformed this relatively more limited strategic concept of the West into the broader liberal international order that could potentially encompass the whole world. And in some ways, this idea became a little bit overstretched and overextended its ambitions without giving sufficient priority to its core engine, in our view, the transatlantic alliance. And so as you look now to the Obama administration, you know, President Obama sought to build a more equitable partnership with Europe, with numerous transatlantic summits and meetings in the first 3 years. And I'm nearly done with his first volume of his memoirs, and it's striking, you know, how much time was spent in meetings with various transatlantic partners. But in some ways, the main diplomatic action and concrete achievements occurred elsewhere. We had the reset with Russia, the pivot to Asia, and the overall new engagement with the world through the G20 and other formats. And the most tangible form of transatlantic cooperation, which was NATO's intervention in Libya in 2011, proved to be a short-lived success, but a long-term cautionary lesson. Of course, during his second term, the Syrian civil war further created the perception of transatlantic divisions. And then by 2014, with Russia's aggression in Ukraine, ISIL's terrorist attacks throughout Europe, and mass irregular migration, into Europe, those crises crystallized the need for transatlantic cooperation. But notwithstanding President Obama's personal popularity among Europeans, and you remember the hundreds of thousands of crowds in Berlin in 2008, and every time he would come to Europe, his personal popularity was always very high. Transatlantic achievements were increasingly difficult to distinguish from global achievements, ranging from nuclear non-proliferation to climate change. And it might be a little bit specific, but his Nobel Peace Prize was never followed by the Charlemagne Prize. In fact, the last American to receive that award was Bill Clinton. And in some ways, the only distinctly transatlantic project, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, was not successful. And NATO's enlargement to Montenegro did not compare in significance to the expansions of the 1990s and 2000s. And so as the transatlantic partnership became more equitable, it also made it more possible that the two sides could drift apart. And so, like I said, for all their personal affinity for President Obama, Europeans are likely to recall the reset with Russia, the red line in Syria, or the pivot to Asia as the main policies that affected them rather than any of the global successes. Let me kick it back to David to provide a further view on the Obama years and basically what the state of play right now over the past 4 years.
Thanks, Bart. So, Bart and I, as Bart said, we believe that President Obama deeply valued the transatlantic relationship, although he clearly hoped, and Karen, I'd be interested to have your comment because you were in the White House at the time, he clearly hoped for a pivot to Asia, later known as a rebalanced Asia. And so that we say in our book that the relationship with Europe was important but not urgent, essential to everything, but prioritizing nothing, with a deep history but an ambivalent future. And I think in the end that President Obama was deeply frustrated in foreign policy because while he wanted this very stable relationship with Europe and he'd hoped to have this rebalance with Asia, and ultimately, his administration became frustrated and mired in the politics and the wars of the Middle East. And there were obviously some significant achievements during the second term, the nuclear agreement with Iran, the climate agreement, and those could not have been done without Europe. Europe was an essential partner. But in the end, they were, I think you would have to call them global agreements. We say that President Obama fortified the transatlantic relationship. And then, of course, it has been severely tested during these last 4 years. And I'm not going to go through in depth, but the Trump years, but clearly the election of Donald Trump, it not only stunned me when I was in Luxembourg, and it stunned a lot of people in this country, but it literally stunned the world. And particularly, I think, the Transatlantic Alliance, because here was an individual who really had no foreign policy experience except for investment in golf courses abroad. And his initial actions vis-a-vis the transatlantic relationship were to appoint an EU ambassador with no prior diplomatic experience, who at one point said that his goal was to destroy the EU. And Trump's inaugural address was also very surprising because notwithstanding that the United States had come out of a serious economic crisis in 2008 and was doing quite well, he described it as a period of carnage that required placing the United States first, America first. And what he was essentially saying was that our alliances would be replaced by a zero-sum approach to global affairs. And so, I think in the end, there are, not surprising that many people believe that the transatlantic relationship has been permanently degraded and perhaps fractured. But I think what we argue is that Trump is an aberration in our history. That he's not a pivot point in U.S. foreign policy. I will say, I think in some ways he harkens back to 18th century America, because it was President Washington who said he didn't believe in any entangling alliances. But certainly for the last 70 years, and as Bart described earlier, we've had ups and downs, some serious disagreements within the transatlantic relationship, but it has always persevered. And we remained optimistic that by undertaking certain new institutional reforms, that there may be a way to resuscitate and again to reestablish the alliance and make it stronger than ever. And we believe that President-elect Biden is perhaps the most important Atlanticist that we've had in the office of the president for years.
Thanks, David. Let me pick up on a point that you made in your first set of comments. Because a central idea in the book is this restatement of the Atlantic Charter. And you very eloquently talked about Roosevelt and Churchill being present at the creation, creating that initial Atlantic Charter. And, I think back to that time when it was clear that it would be the President of the United States together with the British Prime Minister. Okay, presumably the restatement today is not between a President Biden and a British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, but it's not obvious who the counterpart on the European side is. Is it a particular leader? Is it the EU? Is it the NATO Secretary General? Is it all of the above? And then how does that work out in practice? So tell us how concretely you would see a restatement of the Atlantic Charter taking place.
So it's a very, very good question. And, I think that the answer is going to be all of the above to some extent. And it will be difficult, and it will take time. But you can identify who the most important leaders are in Europe today. And it's not going to be 35 leaders. It's going to be a few. It is going to be the leaders of France and Germany. It is going to be the leader of the EU. It is going to be the Secretary General of NATO. So those are all the critical players. But again, I think what the argument that we make is that by simply putting a much greater focus on this, using very different rhetoric, establishing early on a priority that the transatlantic relationship will be first and foremost in our international relations, that we can begin to make enormous progress, and that perhaps we can begin to think about how we do set out this new vision.
Mm-hmm.
Bart?
If I could just follow up briefly, as you probably recall from our time in government, and I saw that in the participants list are a number of our former colleagues from the administration as well, so welcome to everyone. One of the types of memos that we would produce is a blue sky memo, which is, maybe a little bit optimistic, a little bit visionary, but within the realm of the feasible. And in some ways, Karen kindly showed the book cover for our book. It's filled with a blue sky in the middle, and in some ways the book is supposed to be, an endeavor to be ambitious. Thank you again. Ambitious but realistic. And so what we outline in the book is a new Atlantic Charter, which we call the Transatlantic Strategic Partnership Agreement. And we call for the creation of a Transatlantic Council to facilitate better structured dialogue between Europe and America. And that includes the EU leaders, NATO, as well as all the national leaders. It is sort of a big tent approach with some of the key figures in the driver's seat, because we think that for the wider machinery of multilateralism, global collective effort to work, whether it's on humanitarian missions or climate change or other issues, COVID, economic recovery, you will need the transatlantic engine to be repaired, as it were, and to be updated for the challenges of our time. And just to emphasize what David had mentioned, in Europe, the Biden-Harris team will find real partners, but there are conflicting trends. There's greater ambition, but fewer resources, visions of autonomy, but combined with the reality of interdependence, in search of a strategy, but with disjointed tactics, and with good intentions, but discordant outcomes. And so I think our effort here is to kind of seize the moment and take advantage or realize the unique opportunity with the Biden-Harris administration, potentially the most transatlanticist in decades, and to create new structures to make sure that we get better outcomes.
And I'm interested in drawing you both out on this question of the balance, the right balance between those structural changes. So you make a compelling case that we need to reframe the relationship. There's also a strong desire, I think, on both sides to address concretely the pressing challenges of our time. So how do you balance the space and time it takes to reframe and reform institutions versus moving out on taking advantage perhaps of low-hanging fruit where there is agreement and we can use action and concrete results to show to our citizens that the transatlantic relationship can be a constructive force for good? So what's the right balance?
Well, let me just start on that. I think that low-hanging fruit is critical. And what we talk about in the book are sort of 5 areas, Bart referred to it, that we believe there is a lot of commonality and that we can make significant progress: climate, technology, public health, cyber, and trade. And within those 5 categories, I think they're the 2 most obvious where I would hope the Biden administration would immediately engage our European counterparts would be in the areas of public health and climate. And so we need to immediately rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. And, former Secretary Kerry, now Climate Czar Kerry, has said many times that common but differentiated, which was the standard for the Paris Agreement, was important because in the end we had 195 nations join that agreement, but it is not going to be sustaining and it is not going to get us where we need to go ultimately. And so that we'll need to build on that. And but that first step of rejoining, I think is very, very important. Clearly in public health, some of the things that President Trump said about the Europeans early on, look, it was not entirely unfair. The rhetoric, however, was horrible, and he never approached this as a president who believed that the Europeans were actually our friends and could be helpful with this. So that as we think about distribution of the vaccine, as we think about how we move forward to make sure that this is done equitably, fairly, and that everybody who needs to be vaccinated globally is getting access to this. Europe should be a principal partner in this, and I think it's something that again I would hope the Biden administration would immediately begin to work on.
And I would just add that there's some low-hanging fruit that will be relatively easy to reap, but I wouldn't want to just settle for those gains. And in some ways, we should be as cautious about just settling for those opportunities as we are ambitious in terms of further gains. You probably have seen reports about a new EU proposal on EU-US relations that was reported in the FT over the weekend. And it seems that, there are a number of very useful, very concrete proposals that are already being discussed in Brussels and will be at some point presented to the Biden-Harris team. And I think, there's a lot, obviously, that has not been done over the past 4 years that it will be relatively easy to pick up, rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement, restarting some sensible approach on the Iran nuclear deal. But I think we're trying to push a little bit further in the book because, we can, obviously, we had the leisure of over the past 4 years of thinking through these issues and to be a little bit more forward-looking in the blue sky memo spirit. And, in some ways, what I think our argument for the transatlantic partnership is akin to is the Franco-German engine within the European Union. And it's fascinating that, notwithstanding all the levels of integration within Europe and between France and Germany, only a couple of years ago, both countries signed a new treaty of cooperation with new, mechanisms of consultation and exchange of information and so forth between France and Germany as a way to kickstart and kind of reinvent that partnership for effective EU policymaking. And in some ways, that's what we're calling for between America and Europe as a kickstart to the wider liberal order.
Yeah. Well, and I will say what I so enjoyed in reading your book is the areas you define for action overlap beautifully with the areas that a transatlantic task force that GMF and the Bundeskanzler Helmut Schmidt Stiftung set up that I co-chaired with Wolfgang Ischinger. We looked at 6 baskets of issues. So there's real alignment with what you argue in the book. And we tried to lay out some concrete initiatives that could be pursued as well. And I do see the complementary nature of thinking about the overall framing and structure and then those policy recommendations. I wanted to ask you a question that aligns quite nicely with one of the questions in the queue. And, Bart, you had made this comment about how we often have mythologized transatlantic unity in the past. And I think in some cases, Europeans can also mythologize the US and the role it plays, and we can mythologize the extent to which there's European unity. And I really was struck during the past 4 years, the extent to which President Trump divided Europe. And depending on where you were in Europe, there were different views of him. And of course, we know the Polish government embraced Donald Trump and was excited about seeing a United States that would double down on a security guarantee for a country that felt a very concrete threat from its neighbor, Russia. And when you look at France and Germany, it seemed to me that France's view of what was happening in the US was different, perhaps, David, than what you just said, where you said you see Trump as an aberration. And I think many in France believe that there is a deep structural change happening in the United States. And that's why Europe needs to double down on this goal of strategic autonomy, whereas the Germans were more in the camp of seeing Donald Trump as a cyclical change. And now with the election of Biden, the United States is returning to a more traditional view of alliance. They don't think we're returning to some status quo ante, because the United States has changed, Europe has changed, the world has changed over these intervening 4 years. But there is this different view of what is happening in the United States. Is this structural change or is it something cyclical? And there's a question from Michael Kimmage where he says, how do you make sense of the Trump era? His election as a president openly opposed to transatlanticism, his degradation of the liberal international order as president, and his garnering of almost 74 million votes in the 2020 election. What is the status of transatlanticism here at home in the United States? Over to you.
Well, let me just start, and Bart, you can, I'll answer a little bit of this second part of your question, Bart, that you can chime in on the first part. So look, I mean, I think this is something that Richard Haas talks about a lot, which is that we, in order to be successful internationally, we have to show cohesion, strength, democratic values at home. And clearly, that is not where we are at the moment. This is a deeply divided country. And it's one of the things that we talk about in the book. We talk about internal challenges and external challenges in terms of reestablishing both solid transatlantic relations as well as restoring the liberal international order. So it is an issue. And I think and I think President-elect Biden understands this. This is his great challenge. You know, my view on that is that there's nothing like success in order to bring greater cohesion. And so you may think those two are mutually exclusive, not necessarily so. There are, I think, some domestic issues on which we can move forward, and I remain ever hopeful and actually optimistic that there will be some success in the Biden administration on an issue, for example, like infrastructure. And once you have a leader who knows how to talk to the nation, as Franklin Roosevelt did, and as I believe Joe Biden does, you're not going to, in the end, bring everybody along. But I do believe that there's a real possibility that during the next 4 years and perhaps after that, we can bring this country closer together, that there will be some movement within Congress towards a more bipartisan view of certain issues. And certainly, clearly, there are going to be things that Republicans and Democrats are just not going to agree on. But I think if people do want to see a little bit more action and a little bit more positive positive change. And so, you know, as I say, I'm somewhat optimistic there.
And I would just add that, you know, the U.S. foreign policy over the past 4 years has been so all over the place in so many different conflicting directions that on most issues, including European affairs, it's really tough to divine a coherent policy, let alone a strategy towards Europe. On the one hand, you know, the administration wanted to disengage and to pressure Europeans to increase defense spending. On the other hand, it itself increased significantly military spending in Europe and military presence in Europe. And so, you know, likewise, its policy towards Russia was full of conflicting signals. And you could go down the same logic across the different policy areas. And so at the end of the day, I'm just not sure what lines of argument remain from the past 4 years and where, you know, there might be support within the Republican Party for any of the, you know, potential lines of argument from U.S. foreign policy over the past 4 years. And so in many ways, you know, the period has been an aberration, as David said, and it's time to, you know, move forward. Elections have consequences, as is often said. And, you know, with the election of Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, in some ways, the struggle for the soul of the nation has been won in the United States, notwithstanding the ongoing divisions. And now the struggle for the soul of the West is about to begin. And I think, Karen, you pointed to a very important debate in Europe, which is that, you know, there were maybe some conflicting views over the past 4 years, although it's interesting that even from Poland, a former Polish official in the current government emailed me recently saying Joe Biden's election was the best thing that has happened over this past year. So I think, you know, there people will pivot very quickly, and with Russia next door, you know, Poland is just in a strategic position where it needs to cooperate strongly with the United States, whoever is in the White House. But certainly Poland and Central and Eastern Europe will very much welcome the transatlanticism of Joe Biden, the people that he has nominated with Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and Avril Haines, and, you know, just a much tougher and realistic posture towards Russia and the challenge that it poses, as well as just a more sensible way of approaching foreign policy writ large. And so, I think that the main issue to be resolved in some ways in Europe is this tension in some ways between Europe first individuals or Europeanists and transatlanticists like the German defense minister, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer. And, in some ways, that debate is really shifting in the favor of transatlanticists, in the favor of Angela Merkel and individuals like her. And if you follow the debates within the European Council, my sense is that, notwithstanding these siren calls for people who would prefer a Europe first approach, in the end, it will settle, once the dust settles, the center of gravity of opinion will be in favor of transatlanticism.
Right. And we have a question from Frank Belfrage, who is a former deputy foreign minister of Sweden. And he is asking if you could comment on how you see the EU-US trade relationship developing under a Biden administration.
Well, look, I think obviously TTIP was unsuccessful in the last year of the Obama administration. And I think in part that was because there were clearly a lot of disagreements, but it also started very late because we were trying to get the Asia agreement completed, and I think that was the main objective. And so, I think President Trump certainly didn't help the relationship with sanctions on steel and other products. And I would imagine that, again, we will sort of try to reset this relationship in terms of trade and begin anew. Hopefully some things have been learned during the talks on TTIP, but it seems to me that given that both the United States and Europe together are so powerful in terms of their economic potential, and given that trade is such a critical component of the relationship, again, it requires both sides to sort of step back and to really understand what is in the best interest, not only self-interest, but the best interest of both sides globally. And so, again, this is not something that's going to happen overnight, and there are huge impediments and lots of things to overcome. But ultimately, it seems to me that it is something that I would assume President Biden will begin to work on pretty quickly.
And I would just add that, one of the centerpieces of President-elect Biden's and his team's approach to this issue has been ensuring that foreign policy and trade policy serves the American middle class. And so, if you recall to your international economics classes 101, the whole theory of international trade is that you grow the pie, but then with those gains, you can compensate for those sectors of your domestic economy that loses out with international trade because workers lose their jobs or industries lose their incomes. And so that second piece, the domestic policy piece, to try to make sure that workers are retrained, that they're covered for in times of transition, that never came through, not because administrations haven't tried to do so, but oftentimes because it required the cooperation of Congress, and it wasn't tied to the trade negotiations. And so it was interesting, actually. I think last year or a couple of years ago, the former European Commissioner for Trade, Cecilia Malmström, told the story of how, her father was a trade union member, a very active labor union member, but he was also very supportive of international trade. And why was that? It was because in Sweden, if you lost your job because of trade-related transitions, you still had healthcare, you still had good unemployment benefits to be able to use that time to find another job. You had retraining programs. You were basically covered for the benefit of the trade agreements by your domestic programs. And what's missing in the United States and a lot of times in these trade agreements is that additional domestically focused piece. And I think recovering this underlying bargain that you grow the pie, but you also make sure that those who are worse off because of trade agreements are compensated. This will be a very important feature of any negotiations going forward.
Mm-hmm. Super. And I'm going to combine a few questions because they touch on very specific aspects, and you can pick between you which ones you want to speak to. So Pauline Mark is asking, what is the future role of small European states in the Transatlantic Alliance? And I don't know if it was a reaction to the earlier comment that really we're focusing on the larger actors here when we think about restating an Atlantic Charter. So the role of small European countries. Then we have a question from Jana Maizeradze asking, how do you see the future enlargement of NATO and the European Union? Would such enlargement strengthen transatlantic relations? And then thirdly, a question about Turkey. And how do you talk about Turkey in the book? And what is the future relationship of Turkey?
Let me just start quickly with the small country, since I was ambassador to a very small country. Now, look, I can tell you from the point of view of Luxembourgers, they identify themselves as Luxembourgers, but the European Union is critical to them. They see themselves almost equally as Europeans, Luxembourgers and Europeans. And it's enormously important to them what happens in the EU. It's enormously, even though they were not, in terms of their contributions to NATO, where they should have been, NATO was extraordinarily important to them. And they recognize that. And so I think that that actually is pretty consistent with throughout Europe with a number of smaller European nations who benefit from the enormous potential of the European market, who benefit enormously from the mutual security of NATO that I talked about earlier. And so that, in the end, I think it's the larger countries where there is more talk of autonomy, where there's more talk of the European Defense Force, where there's more disagreement. And so again, that's going to be the area. It's not, this is not something that happens overnight. Europe is always going to be somewhat herding cats, but it's, I think smaller countries recognize the great benefit.
And I would just say that, I think President Obama had it right that there are no junior or senior partners in the transatlantic relationship. From the perspective of the United States, there are no small or large European countries. There are European allies and European partners. And in some ways, what we propose with the Transatlantic Council is a big tent approach that would include, not just in U.S.-EU summit between the U.S. president and the European Commission president and the president of the European Council, without all the other European national leaders or with the NATO Secretary General, but everyone together around a big table. And, obviously these types of discussions have their own downsides because it's a big table, everyone wants to speak. But I think what we argue in the book is that really this big tent approach is imperative because we really need everyone to step up and to be able to push forward in the same direction. And the downside of either, trying to envision reinforcing solely NATO or solely the US-EU pillar is that you do miss out on a lot of the other constituent parts of the transatlantic partnership. And so, this is certainly a big tent approach. And also, our core argument again is that even though Europe and America are partners of first resort, they're not the only resort. And especially when you speak about challenges coming from China, or dealing with the global pandemic with COVID-19, or issues like climate change, obviously all those challenges will require other partners such as Japan, Australia, South Korea, India, others. And so, our approach is really to start where we think we'll be able to not only have like-mindedness, but also be able to have the economic and diplomatic and military weight to do something about the individual problems, and then branch out. And if you think our big tent approach is too optimistic, you can only just look back to the global coalition, to the ISIS that the Obama administration put together, and I think at the end of 2016 numbered something like 60 member states as part of that global coalition. Likewise, any global health summit that you could imagine putting together will include a lot of countries. And so what we really argue for is restoring the ethos that will drive global change. Now, very briefly on EU and NATO enlargement, look, I think no one's probably anticipating rapid enlargements of either institution to the extent that you had in the 1990s and early 2000s. On the other hand, we don't want to foreclose that possibility when the time is ripe, when global conditions are more susceptible to that type of expansion. And we also don't want to, let that issue hijack all the potential areas of cooperation between the EU and other partners on the one hand, or NATO and other partners on the other hand. And so I think we just need to think a little bit more creatively about how both institutions and their reach can be expanded, even if not, formally the membership might not enlarge in the near term future. And finally, on Turkey, Turkey is a very difficult question for the United States and for Europe, and dates back to the Obama-Biden administration. I don't think we have very creative ideas on how to deal with that particular issue. It will be a crisis to continue to manage. Obviously, there are conflicting trade-offs that will have to be taken into account, but to be sure, it's one of the pressing issues for the transatlantic partnership.
So we have.
Yeah, I don't think.
Oops, I'm sorry, David.
I was just going to say, I don't think Turkey is going to be a member of the EU anytime soon. And in terms of, in terms of its NATO connection, it's not acting like an ally. Is, I think, where I would leave it.
Okay. We have a number of questions about China, and let me just raise two of them with you. One is from Payam Galadar, saying, how likely is it for the Biden administration to condition the continuation of U.S. security guarantees to Europe on the latter's siding with the United States in the burgeoning great power competition with China? The other one I want to flag for you is from John Emerson, who, along with being a former U.S. ambassador to Germany, is a trustee of GMF. So I'm delighted that he's listening in. He is saying, I was part of a conference with German CEOs in Bavaria this fall, and much of the conversation was focused on U.S., Europe, China, with emphasis on the split between the European view and the U.S. approach. Clearly, a transatlantic approach to China as it relates to trade, WTO, rule of law, climate, and human rights will be critical. How do you see that developing? So over to you.
That's that's probably the biggest question out there, I think. So you saved it for last. These are until recently, Europe wasn't really focused on China. And I think the one thing that the Trump administration has done was to allow Europeans to really begin to think much more creatively and more long-term about their relationship with China. And what we argue in the book is that, again, in terms of our set of values, our history, we have so much more in common with Europe, and that in terms of our economic power together, we are a great deal more powerful than China economically and militarily. And so that, again, I don't think there'll be a conditioning, but I do think there will be a lot of persuasion and I think common sense, I would hope, that would prevail here in terms of what is the more natural relationship moving forward. But this is going to be managing China, which has been extremely aggressive in terms of not only its outreach across Asia, but increasingly in Europe, is going to be a challenge.
Yeah, I would just say on this particular issue, I'm perhaps somewhat hopeful, because even the Trump administration at the 11th hour stumbled into the logic that needs allies to be able to confront a challenge such as China. And so in recent weeks, you had a readout from a call between Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and HRVP Joseph Borrell, launching an US-EU dialogue on China. Now, I think the Biden-Harris team will recognize this logic much earlier, and you've seen statements from Secretary of State nominee Tony Blinken, as well as National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, on the importance of European and Asian partners for the United States in confronting China. And not only in confronting it, but also recognizing some areas of cooperation where you need China on board, whether on climate change or on dealing with the pandemic. And so here, I would imagine that this is an issue that will be front and center of the transatlantic partnership. And I'm also, perhaps somewhat more hopeful that the center of gravity in European public opinion and elite opinion right now is actually more akin to what it is in the United States than may have been the case a couple of years ago. And so you've seen a sea change, at least in Brussels, and thinking within the EU institutions on the challenge that China poses, that it's a systemic rival in some ways, and that really the United States and Europe need to work together. I would just close with one caveat that, sometimes, for instance, French President Emmanuel Macron equivocates between, China and the United States and Russia, and how Europe needs to develop strategic autonomy and sovereignty as a way of balancing against all the other great powers, and essentially putting the United States in the same category as Russia and China, and without distinguishing between friend and foe and ally and adversary. And so I think this would not be the right way to frame the issue. I think the right way to frame the issue is, where do you have alignment again around common values of democracy, human rights, rule of law, free and fair trade, and market capitalism? And if you frame the question from that perspective, obviously the United States and Europe have a lot more in common with each other than with anyone else among the great powers. And so, on this, as well as on many other issues, really the time for repair is now. And I think the next 4 years and perhaps longer will be a very exciting time for the Transatlantic Partnership.
Well, David and Bart, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you both so much for sharing the powerful ideas that are in your book with all of us. I am hopeful that you sold 100 copies of Partners of First Resort in this hour, because I'm sure it got everyone on the call very interested in reading the full text. You made a compelling case that this is the moment to renew the U.S.-European alliance, that it is very much in the interests of the United States and in the interest of Europe, and that transatlantic cooperation can power positive global outcomes. So thank you for sharing this with us. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. I apologize to all of you whose questions I wasn't able to ask. There were so many wonderful questions in the queue, and thank you for that participation. And I wish everyone a wonderful last month of 2020. So thanks and bye-bye.
Thank you, Karen.
Thanks, Karen. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.